Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a really fascinating one lined up for you. We are going to be objectively unpacking a highly charged, heavily discussed political argument from the YouTube channel Freedom Frontline, which features former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Now look, when you mix politics and religion, things can get heated, like instantly. But as always, our goal here isn't to take a side or tell you what to think. Not at all. Our mission is just to break down the structure of their argument, analyze the evidence they bring to the table, and lay it out clearly so you can understand exactly what's being claimed. It is a literal masterclass in modern political framing, and we're going to dissect it step by step.
Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the core political claim. Second, trust in voter demographics. Third, judicial nominees and religion. Fourth, the battle for objective truth. And finally, comparisons to historical regimes.
Starting off with Section 1, the core political claim, and this idea of a shift towards secularism.
So, the foundational thesis of the Freedom Frontline argument is that there's been this massive, seismic shift in political culture. They argue that the Democratic Party is actively targeting Catholics and Christians, basically seeking to eliminate mentions of God from every single facet of public life and forcing faith strictly into the private sphere. That's a pretty heavy claim, right? So, what evidence do they actually use to back up this cultural observation?
Well, they point to highly visible public events. And this brilliantly illustrates how the source uses a very specific anecdote to ground their broader claim about secularism. They highlight the Democratic National Convention, the one held virtually over Zoom back during the COVID pandemic. The source points out that during a recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance, there was a deliberate omission of the phrase "under God," leaving what they describe as an awkward silence. For the creators of this argument, this wasn't just some accidental gaffe. It's presented as hard evidence of a systemic, purposeful scrubbing of faith from the party's public identity. Which brings us to Section 2, Trust and Voter Demographics, looking specifically at the Time magazine data. Now, an argument like this requires way more than just anecdotes. It needs hard data. To quantify this cultural disconnect, the source cites numbers from Time magazine. According to this data, a staggering 75% of Christian voters report having little to no trust in the Democratic Party. That leaves a pretty small 25% minority who maintain some or high trust. The source uses this massive trust deficit to validate their claim that religious voters are feeling incredibly alienated.
But they go even further, isolating an even more severe statistic: 62%. According to the data they present, 62% of Christian voters say they would never even consider voting for a Democrat. The source highlights this standalone number to emphasize the sheer severity of the partisan divide. They're arguing this isn't just a slight preference issue, it's an outright rejection by a majority of Christian voters based on the cultural shifts we were just talking about.
Now, to be fair, the source does acknowledge a really crucial nuance in the data. They explicitly note that Time magazine credited Black voters and the Black church as the most reliable members of the Democratic coalition. In fact, they point out that the Black church is the primary, maybe even the only, reason these trust metrics aren't even worse for the party. They present the Black church as this last remaining religious anchor in an otherwise increasingly secular coalition.
So why are these voters leaving? Well, the argument is that it's because politicians actively view traditional religious beliefs as obstacles. They use quotes just like this one to make their case. Deep-seated cultural codes, religious beliefs, and structural biases have to be changed. The source frames this rhetoric as concrete proof that political elites believe religious views literally must be dismantled in order to pass and enforce modern laws, specifically those surrounding reproductive health care. To them, this is clear evidence of religion being treated as a problem to be solved rather than a right to be respected.
All right, moving on to Section 3, Judicial Nominees and Religion, examining specific confirmations.
Here, the argument transitions from general cultural rhetoric to actual on-the-record government proceedings. They bring up specific lawmakers, including Kamala Harris, during her time on the Judiciary Committee. The source claims that Harris actually weaponized the judicial nominee's devout Catholicism against him. They detail how she scrutinized the nominee over his membership in the Knights of Columbus, which is a well-known Catholic fraternal organization. The argument here is that her opposition was based specifically on his observant faith, treating his religious affiliation as a disqualifying factor for the bench.
And then, of course, they bring up this highly recognizable moment: the late Senator Dianne Feinstein speaking directly to Amy Coney Barrett during her confirmation hearings, famously saying, "The dogma lives loudly within you." The source leans heavily on this quote. They argue it's definitive proof of an unconstitutional religious test being applied to public office.
They present these hearings as evidence that the political elite are perfectly fine with religious freedom, but only as long as it doesn't conflict with their preferred political agenda.
To really hammer this point home, the source draws a stark contrast regarding the actual definition of religious freedom. They define it as the constitutional right to hold any belief system, whether you're Christian, atheist, Buddhist, Hindu, you name it, and practice it publicly without facing a religious test for public office. They contrast that with what they claim the party elite actually supports, a version of freedom where religion is strictly a private, hidden matter that has absolutely no place in public service or public life.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this all builds into the battle for objective truth in Tulsi Gabbard's underlying theory. Up until now, we've mostly been looking at the symptoms. Now the source attempts to diagnose the root cause. They argue this is fundamentally a battle between two competing paradigms. On one side, you have trusting in God and objective truth. On the other side, trusting in government institutions and a rigid political ideology. The source's view is that an influential activist wing has systematically replaced faith in a higher power with a rigid, almost religious faith in government authority. Tulsi Gabbard actually speaks directly to this point in the source material. She says, quote, "At its heart, when you have a party that is controlled by people who don't believe in objective truth, they want to be the authority that tells us what is true and what is not true." By attributing this directly to Gabbard, the argument highlights her claim that this entire conflict isn't really about everyday policy disagreements, it's fundamentally about establishing ultimate authority over truth itself.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that Gabbard frames this as a full-blown struggle for absolute power. The argument is that political elites want to dictate reality, like, for example, the existence of biological differences between men and women. They target religious believers specifically because those individuals answer to a higher moral authority and will not, in her exact words, bend the knee to government elites. Believers are viewed as a direct threat to ideological conformity. Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Comparisons to Historical Regimes, Echoes of the Past.
To really drive home the perceived danger of these modern political trends, the source goes back and connects them to the playbooks of historical socialist movements. First, they point to the Soviet era, where authorities heavily restricted religious institutions purely because they competed with state authority. Then, they contrast that with the modern Chinese Communist Party, which takes a slightly different approach. Rather than eliminating religion entirely, they push religious leaders to reinterpret scripture so that it aligns perfectly with Communist Party policies. The source draws a direct line here, comparing modern democratic tactics in the US to these very specific, historical authoritarian methods of controlling a population.
And that brings us to the ultimate conclusion of the Freedom Frontline argument. They claim there's a clear, undeniable pattern at play. With the rise of what they identify as socialism within the Democratic Party, political ideology absolutely must come first. And because of this, it inevitably clashes with Christian teachings. In their view, this anti-religious push isn't just some accident, it's a calculated, necessary requirement for achieving total ideological dominance.
Which leaves us with this final, really profound question to consider. How will the tension between rigid political ideology and deep-seated religious faith shape our future political coalitions? Whether you completely agree with the framing presented by Tulsi Gabbard and Freedom Frontline, or you vehemently oppose it, understanding how this argument is structured is absolutely vital to understanding modern political discourse. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. I really hope you found this breakdown helpful, and I encourage you to keep thinking critically about how these dynamics impact the world around us. Catch you next time.